Buenos días, buenas tardes y buenas noches para quienes se conectan hoy en este evento enmarcado en el Día Internacional de la Eliminación de la Discriminación Racial. Sean bienvenidos y bienvenidas a este seminario en línea sobre lo que puede hacerse desde las instituciones de educación superior para erradicar el racismo en sus sociedades. En nombre del Instituto Internacional de la UNESCO para la Educación Superior en América Latina y el Caribe, IESALC, el Centro Internacional para la Gestión de la Educación Superior, y el Grupo de Trabajo para la Igualdad Racial, ambos de la Universidad de Bath, Reino Unido, la Universidad Nacional de 3 de febrero, UNTREF en Argentina, la Universidad de las Indias Occidentales en el Caribe y la Universidad de las Regiones Autónomas de la Costa Nicaragüense Huracán, les agradecemos su participación en este webinar. Antes de comenzar el programa de hoy, invitamos a los panelistas a mantener sus micrófonos apagados cuando no estén participando. Aprovechamos para anunciar que este evento cuenta con traducción simultánea al inglés y al español. Si necesita traducción al español, por favor active el botón en el menú inferior que dice Interpretación y seleccione Español. Lo mismo para el inglés. If you need interpretation to English, please select it on the menu. También les recordamos que este evento está siendo grabado y posteriormente será publicado en el canal de YouTube de IESALC. También estamos planificando crear un podcast en este seminario web para facilitar el acceso a esta información donde quiera que ustedes vayan. En la última parte de este seminario responderemos a todas las preguntas que sean posibles, para lo cual les invitamos a enviarlas por el chat en inglés o en español en cualquier momento. Paso entonces a dar la bienvenida a nuestra moderadora de hoy, Sabzalieva, analista principal de políticas en UNESCO IESALC, donde dirige una serie de proyectos entre los que se incluyen los futuros de la educación superior, las formas de movilidad de los estudiantes y la libertad académica. Está formada en educación comparada y en política educativa internacional, lo que ha puesto en práctica a través de la investigación, la enseñanza, el análisis de políticas y la administración de la educación superior. Nuestra segunda moderadora es Salma Ahmed, actualmente en prácticas en el IESALC. Es licenciada en educación y actualmente forma parte del máster Erasmus Mundus en políticas educativas para el desarrollo global. También tiene experiencia trabajando como miembro de la Selección Nacional para la Igualdad y la Diversidad en el mayor sindicato de profesores de Noruega. Bienvenidas a ambas. Emma, tienes la palabra.
Thank you very much, Sarah. A very warm welcome again to everybody joining us from all around the world today. So today we're continuing the conversation that we started at a webinar held last November, and that webinar was titled Racism in the Academy, Global Perspectives on Multiple Forms of Racism and Struggles for Equity. So today what we want to try and do with our esteemed colleagues is move the discussion forward to the real action that universities, colleges and higher education institutions can take to genuinely challenge and contribute to the discussion towards moving towards the eradication of all forms of racial discrimination in higher education. So my colleague Salma, Ahmed and I will start by putting 2 questions forward to each of the panelists, and we're going to ask them to speak for about 5 minutes in turn in response. So during the first question, we'll also have the pleasure of being able to introduce the panelists when they first speak. So the first question that we're going to cover in today's session, before then later opening up for questions and answers. So colleagues, we encourage you to post these in the chat as we go through. But the first question we'll start with is this one. What are the main ways in which racism affects and/or historically has affected the societies and higher education institutions, systems, and public policies in the context in which you develop your work? Relatedly, what would be the main objectives and challenges that these higher education institutions, systems, and public policies should face in order to eradicate racism within themselves and in the respective societies? So to take up the question, we'll start with 2 familiar faces. So first, I'd like to introduce Professor Daniel Mato, who's principal researcher at the National Council for Scientific and Technical Research, CONICET, and Director of the UNESCO Chair in Higher Education and Indigenous and Afro-Descendant Peoples in Latin America at Universidad Nacional de 3 de Febrero in Argentina. Professor Mato chairs the Initiative for the Eradication of Racism in Higher Education in Latin America. He's published extensively in the fields of cultural diversity, racism and higher education, and culture, communication, and social transformation. So for the next 5 minutes, Daniel, tiene usted la palabra.
Muchas gracias, Emma. Buenos días, buenas tardes o buenas noches, según los casos, a todas y todos. Muchísimas gracias por este esfuerzo a IESALC y a nuestras universidades que respaldan esta iniciativa. Para no gastar tan rápidamente mis 5 minutos, paso a contestar lo más rápidamente posible. Pienso que para comenzar es necesario diferenciar entre racismo y discriminación racial. El racismo es tanto una ideología como un régimen de poder que es constitutivo del mundo moderno y de todas nuestras sociedades. La discriminación racial es solamente una de las manifestaciones del racismo, la más evidente. En América Latina, este régimen de poder históricamente ha afectado y continúa afectando especialmente a pueblos indígenas y afrodescendientes. En las sociedades latinoamericanas, el racismo está tan naturalizado que la mayoría de la población suele limitar el uso del concepto de racismo a hechos explícitos de discriminación racial. Algunas formas naturalizadas de racismo están tan arraigadas en nuestras sociedades que hacen que restricciones no explícitas que impiden a personas indígenas y afrodescendientes acceder a la educación superior y cuando lo logran dificultan sus trayectorias y posibilidades de graduación, no se vean como racismo. Por ejemplo, las desventajas económicas y la localización de las instituciones de educación superior son problemas destacados para ambos grupos de población, pero no son los únicos obstáculos que deben enfrentar. Además, frecuentemente deben lidiar con diferencias lingüísticas y con desventajas educativas originadas, frecuentemente, en la menor calidad de sus oportunidades de educación primaria y secundaria. Otra forma de racismo es la exclusión en el currículo, en los planes de estudio, de las cosmovisiones, historias, lenguas, epistemologías, sistemas de conocimiento y modalidades de aprendizaje de los pueblos afrodescendientes e indígenas. Estas exclusiones, además, y para peor, suelen ir acompañadas de la escasez o incluso de la ausencia absoluta de docentes indígenas y afrodescendientes. Todas estas exclusiones repercuten en la calidad de la educación de todos los estudiantes, todas las estudiantes, sean o no indígenas o afrodescendientes. Sin embargo, en el caso de estudiantes indígenas y afrodescendientes, operan como factores de extrañamiento y terminan haciéndoles sentir que las universidades o las instituciones de educación superior no son para ellas o ellos, y de este modo afectan sus trayectorias educativas. Desde el periodo colonial, la educación superior ha jugado un papel importantísimo en la naturalización y reproducción del racismo. La educación superior puede y debe comprometerse activamente en la democratización de nuestras sociedades, porque en la educación superior se forman les y los docentes de todos los niveles educativos que reproducen o no el racismo según sean formados. Pero también se forman profesionales en todos los campos, que pasan luego a jugar papeles de alta incidencia en la vida económica, política y social de las respectivas sociedades. Para acabar con la naturalización y reproducción del racismo necesitamos una educación superior que sea intercultural y antirracista. No alcanza con que sea intercultural. Esto quiere decir que es necesario revisar los planes de estudio de todas las carreras para incluir las visiones de mundo, idiomas, conocimientos, modalidades de aprendizaje y modos de producción de conocimiento de estos pueblos. Además, es necesario establecer programas de acción afirmativa que aseguren los derechos de participación de integrantes de pueblos indígenas y afrodescendientes, no solo como estudiantes, también como docentes y como autoridades en las instituciones y en los sistemas de educación superior. Es necesario además asegurar que la localización de las instituciones de educación superior tome en cuenta las necesidades y propuestas de estos pueblos. Es necesario además promover la creación de universidades y otros tipos de instituciones de educación superior de carácter intercultural. Y sobre todo, y frecuentemente omitido, es necesario reconocer y apoyar las instituciones propias de estos pueblos, como lo establecen los convenios internacionales vigentes en todos nuestros países, no solo el convenio 169, sino también la Declaración de Naciones Unidas para los Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas, la Declaración de Durban, etc. Y finalmente, entonces, es necesario impulsar campañas de educación pública en colaboración con organizaciones indígenas y afrodescendientes que muestren la incidencia de las herencias del pasado en nuestras sociedades contemporáneas. Y es necesario promover reflexiones, debates y acciones para erradicar el racismo de las políticas de educación superior, universitarias o no, de los sistemas de educación superior y de las instituciones de educación superior, incluidas, desde luego, las aulas y nuestras prácticas docentes. Muchísimas gracias.
Daniel, thank you so much. Some very important points being raised here as we open the webinar. Let us now warmly welcome our second speaker. So Professor Rajani Naidoo is UNESCO Chair in Higher Education Management, and since our last webinar in November, she's now also taken on the position of Vice President for Community and Inclusion at the University of Bath in the UK. Rajani is also Director of the International Centre for Higher Education Management at Bath. Before this, she contributed to an alternative higher education institution that was set up to act as a model for transformation in post-apartheid South Africa. Her publications and research projects focus on the escalation of competition, audit, and bureaucracy in higher education, and the contribution of universities to inclusive development and social justice. So Rajani and Daniel, who are our two speakers from last November, we're thrilled to have you back. Rajani, let me welcome you and hand the floor to you for the next 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma, and thank you, Salma and Sarah as well, for this great privilege of being engaged in this very important conversation with all our speakers and our audience as well. What I would like to do is to share my personal view. And I would like to start by talking about apartheid South Africa. So in South Africa, of course, the apartheid government was openly racist. There were laws, there were policies, there was punishment to develop and to protect racism. Every area of life, including universities, were racially segregated by law and were completely unequal. The government divided people into people that were classified as white, people that were classified as Indian, people that were classified as colored, and people that were classified as African. And the people that were classified as Africans suffered the greatest racial discrimination. And the whole apartheid machinery was, of course, to ensure that white people who were in the minority would remain in a privileged position. So the same with universities. The richest universities with the most autonomy were reserved for those who were classified as white, while the poorest universities that were controlled by the army in some cases and by the government always were classified for people that were classified as African. And some people would say, why do I bring up this past in our present? And there are two reasons that I want to bring up this past. The first is because much of this history of apartheid South Africa remains with us in the present day in South Africa, but also in very, very many different parts of the world. In South Africa, we no longer have apartheid. and the rich universities now have many students of African descent, but they are middle-class students. African working-class students remain completely excluded. Or if they do enter the elite universities, they become what Mkuve Musuta terms push-outs. They are not dropouts. They are pushed out because our universities are not set up to support them to succeed. I also bring this up because in Britain, after an inquiry into the murder of a young man called Stephen Lawrence, the term institutional racism began to be accepted. This is the understanding that racism is maintained, racism is protected, and racism is reproduced, not just by individual people, but by a whole system of policies, regulations, organizations, and culture that is very, very deeply embedded in society. And of course, the heroic work of the Black Lives Matter movement has shown us, and other organizations as well that Daniel has spoken about, have shown us that institutional racism exists today. But this understanding is being challenged in two ways. First, there is the claim by many governments now that there is no such thing as institutional racism. Instead, we are told that racism happens because some people have an unconscious bias against people of color. So if we find these people and if we train them, racism will actually disappear. The second danger is from right-wing political organizations that are growing very strong in the USA, in Europe, in South and Latin America. These organizations claim to represent poor white communities that have been left behind. They divide people. They create a false choice between white people who are suffering and people of color that are suffering. My colleague Aurélien Mondon shows that the ideas from these groups of people, these organizations, have been mainstreamed by the media and by liberal governments. Rather than calling them racist, we give them legitimacy by calling them populists. Rather than protecting the rights of poor and powerless white communities, they gain votes by making immigrants or people of color the enemy, while at the same time they open up countries to predatory forms of capitalism that enslave working class people everywhere. As John Brennan and I have shown, universities can reproduce racism, but they can also help to challenge racism. So for me, the problem with what is happening now is that the small gains that we have made as universities is under attack. We have to protect these gains and we have to move forward, and we have to find ways to connect to all of our excluded communities. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you so much, Rajani. Thank you. And now I have the pleasure to introduce Professor Alta Hooker. Professor Hooker is an Afro-descendant woman, nurse by profession, with a master's degree in intercultural public health and postgraduate degree in university management. She's rector of the University of the Autonomous Regions of the Nicaraguan Caribbean Coast since 2003, and currently, she's also coordinator of the Network of Indigenous Intercultural and Community Universities of Abya Yala. She's also a researcher and international lecturer on topics such as human rights, intercultural models of health and education, cultural diversity, and interculturality in higher education. So over to you, Alta.
Buenos días. Realmente es un gran placer poder estar en este foro, especialmente en este día. Felicitar de todo corazón a los organizadores. Yo quisiera decir que el racismo y la discriminación racial sigue vigente en nuestro contexto y es una cuestión que se vive a diario. De la misma manera se ve en las diferentes estructuras y sistemas. Pero los principales denominadores, no estoy diciendo que son los únicos, ¿verdad? Es la invisibilización, es la negación, es la mitificación, es la pasividad y la exclusión principalmente. Ahora, y esto tiene grandes implicancias en la vida, especialmente de pueblos indígenas y afrodescendientes. Primero, creo que es fundamental que los países reconozcan la presencia de diferentes poblaciones que viven en su territorio, ¿verdad? Que es parte de la negación. Si no se acepta de que hay personas con sueños y aspiraciones diferentes, entonces es completamente imposible poder tener políticas públicas que responden a la necesidad de estas personas. Ahora, al discriminar los procesos de racismo, conlleva con ella de que perdemos todo ese proceso de aporte que puedan hacer estas poblaciones al desarrollo desde su propia iniciativa, pero desde sus propios saberes, desde sus propios conocimientos, desde su propia manera de producir conocimiento. La lucha contra el racismo, entonces, tiene que ser una voluntad política de las autoridades de la educación superior. Y aquí podemos decir que hacer eso va mucho más allá que solo el acceso. Es mucho más complicado. Es el reconocimiento, es el uso de las lenguas de las personas en las aulas de clase, es el uso de que estas compañeras y compañeros pueden hacer uso de su historia desde su propia manera de ver el mundo. Si no lo hacemos de esa manera, ¿cómo vamos a aportar? ¿Cómo vamos a poder ser parte de un desarrollo donde ni siquiera nuestros conocimientos están presentes? Entonces, la educación superior tiene una responsabilidad fundamental en una educación que empodera, pero una educación que no me haga sentirme vergonzosa de ser negra, sino que me empodera y me hace sentirme orgullosa del pueblo al que pertenezco. La conferencia regional de la CRES en el 2008 y el 2018 jugó un papel fundamental para pueblos indígenas y afrodescendientes. Y en este proceso nosotros podemos decir que trajeron al tapete la interculturalidad, que es todo un proceso de construcción de las relaciones entre los diferentes pueblos, pero también planteó algunos indicadores claros de lo que debe hacer la educación superior para poder hacer que estos compañeros y compañeras se sienten parte de y no un apéndice de algo, y como si es un favor que se les está haciendo al estar dentro de la aula de clase. Lo otro que me gustaría compartir es que entendemos nosotros que la interculturalidad representa una muy buena intención, es una voluntad, es una oportunidad y una posibilidad para poder fortalecer o construir puentes de inclusión de los derechos, de las cosmovisiones, de las historias y de los trayectos de vida de la comunidad universitaria. Y es así que se necesitan entonces políticas y acciones institucionales que fortalezcan las identidades culturales de la población estudiantil y espacios para que tales diferencias se expresen en el diálogo intercultural. Lo otro, yo termino en esta primera pregunta diciendo que Para esto es fundamental reconocer a los pueblos indígenas y afrodescendientes como pueblos, porque eso conlleva el derecho colectivo a enfermarse de manera diferente, a una educación diferente. Eso significa el uso de nuestras lenguas en todos los diferentes espacios que existen. Significa tierra, significa territorio, significa historia, significa espiritualidad. Entonces, son algunos aspectos que me parecen fundamentales en este primer momento. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Alta. A very great wrap-up. Our fourth and last speaker for today is Professor Verena Shepherd. She is a graduate of the University of the West Indies and the University of Cambridge and Honorary Fellow, Jesus College, Cambridge. She currently is a Professor Emerita of Social History at the University of West Indies, Director of the Center for Operation Research at the University for the West Indies, a Vice Chair of the CARICOM Reparation Commission, and a Vice Chair of the oldest UN treaty body, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. So the floor is yours, Verena.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Moderator. Greetings to my fellow panelists and our virtual audience. I applaud UNESCO for organizing this event on this International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, a day proclaimed by the United Nations General Assembly in 1966, 6 years after the tragedy in South Africa that inspired its proclamation. And among those 69 men, women, and children killed by the police at a peaceful demonstration in Sharpeville, South Africa, against the apartheid laws were Wiki Bakela, James Beshi, Ephraim Chaka, Gilbert Dimo, Elliot Kabe, Miriam Lekitla, and Paulina Mafulasi. And may their souls rest in power. The questions posed for our deliberation today are critical and speak to the raison d'etre of higher educational institutions, especially teacher training colleges and universities that train students to become knowledge bearers and knowledge disseminators. Against this background, my overall response to the issues before us is that higher education institutions in the Americas must commit to social inclusion, diversity, and educational access for all, including access for those traditionally left behind and discriminated against. It is a fact that many higher educational institutions in our region have managed to demonstrate the importance of a social justice agenda in their teaching and learning processes, and in the production of students and staff who are scholar activists. Professor Emerita of the University of the West Indies, Luz Longsworth, captures a critical mandate of the activist university rather well. She says a university must demonstrate its activism not only in public advocacy, but also in its teaching and learning, its ethical interactions, and its global engagement. So it was that strategic imperative demonstrated in teaching and learning at the University of the West Indies, where I have most experience and where I will be speaking about, I'll be speaking about that today. So it was that, let me say again, it was that strategic imperative demonstrated in teaching and learning at the UWI after its establishment in 1948, which identified it as a university engaged in education for transformation of a people grappling with the diseases of colonialism and its continuing legacies. Most of the UWI campuses are located on former sugar plantations, and out of the ruins of those plantations, those crumbled ruins, that plantation past. It's a university that used to have a colonial era chancellor, Britain's Princess Alice. We now have administrators from the region, including a vice chancellor, whose roots lie in the peasantry. The staff and students also include those descended from indigenous peoples, Maroons, Garifuna, Maya, Kalinago, enslaved Africans, and indentured Indians who understand the power of education for upward social mobility. So this change in leadership created a more activist and social justice imperative to education in the region. It allowed for scholar activists, or what late historian Walter Rodney refers to as maroon intellectuals, to emerge within the teaching and learning space. So my interest is based on my location within the walls of academia in a university. With respect to the first two-part question, and I won't repeat the question, the moderator has framed the question. So I answer as follows. One, in the past, indigenous peoples, ex-indentured Indians, and the children of working class Blacks had lower access to higher education. But since I started to be involved in teaching at the tertiary level, I have not seen the escalation in racial discrimination in the CARICOM region. But we inherited that ideology of exclusion, and we are working towards eliminating that. So race/ethnicity don't play the part they used to play in the policies governing higher education institutions in the Caribbean, although racism used to masquerade as classism in these institutions up to the 1970s. Secondly, as a member of a UN treaty body that gets complaints from marginalized communities in the region, though, I know that indigenous peoples and people of African descent face discrimination in access to higher education in some parts of the Americas. And we confront that all the time when indigenous peoples, victims or descendants of marginalized groups come before the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And the third thing I want to say in this first round is that racism does exist in the largest society in the Caribbean, in the CARICOM region, even where people of African descent are in the majority. So, because there's structural racism, there's systemic racism. So students of higher educational institutions in my region must be trained to be change makers and help to fight against racial discrimination in the larger society, especially in countries still trapped in the ideologies and practices of the colonial era. So I'll have more to say as when we go to round two, question two. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Verena. Thank you to all our four speakers. We will now be moving on to our second question. Again, this is for all panelists. We will ask you to speak in turn and up to 5 minutes each. Could you please comment on some experiences or proposals for transformations in academic practices and/or in higher education institutions, systems and policies oriented towards the eradication of racism? So we'll follow the same pattern as before. We can start with Professor Daniel first.
Thank you, Salma, and thank you every one of my colleague speakers for their interesting analysis. We have sometime discussion on these issues with all of them practically. Well, going to the first part of the second question, just to highlight some of the, I'm sorry, I was supposed to speak in Spanish, I'm sorry. Get back into Spanish. Aunque voy a la primera parte de la pregunta, hay avances, son tremendamente insuficientes, pero hay avances por lo menos en América Latina, en Estados Unidos, en Canadá, en Nueva Zelanda, en Australia, incluso en Gran Bretaña, con políticas como las que se impulsan en Bath, de lo que Rajani juega un papel de liderazgo. Voy a concentrarme simplemente en mencionar muy rápido algunos avances en América Latina que involucran decisiones de los estados. Voy a poner a la vista algunas, digamos, buenas decisiones o buenas iniciativas de algunos estados, a ver si los que no menciono tratan de hacer algo. Entonces comenzaré diciendo que si bien no es lo mismo una universidad intercultural creada desde el Estado que creada desde los pueblos, al menos hay varios estados en América Latina que han creado universidades interculturales. México desde 2003 ha creado 13, Panamá acaba de crear no una universidad intercultural, sino algo más ambicioso, en colaboración con organizaciones indígenas, que es una universidad nacional de los pueblos indígenas. En Bolivia, desde el 2008, se han creado 3 universidades interculturales. En Perú, desde 1999, se han creado 4. En Ecuador ha habido idas y vueltas en el reconocimiento de una universidad creada por sectores del movimiento indígena, que primero fue aceptada como universidad privada, luego fue cerrada por el Estado, y ahora hay una comisión que está, digamos, reinventándola, por así decirlo. Pero también hay que destacar, por ejemplo, que en Brasil, en tiempos de Lula da Silva y Dilma Rousseff, la ley de cuotas estableció que las universidades e institutos federales deberían reservar el 50% de las plazas, de los cupos, para estudiantes procedentes de escuelas públicas. Y dentro de esto establece cupos específicos para estudiantes afrodescendientes y de pueblos indígenas. Pero hay un par de casos que creo que son aún más interesantes por el avance que implican. Uno es precisamente el caso de la UAIN, de la Universidad Autónoma Indígena Intercultural de Colombia, que en el 2018 fue reconocida por el Ministerio de Educación Nacional. Esta universidad fue creada en 1998, 20 años antes, por el Consejo Regional Indígena del Cauca, pero ahora es reconocida por el Estado y dotada presupuestariamente. Y otro ejemplo interesante es el que se ha dado en Nicaragua, donde Huracán, la universidad de la cual es rectora la colega Alta Hooker, y la Bluefields Indian Caribbean University, han sido reconocidas como universidades interculturales y comunitarias por el Estado nicaragüense y dotadas de presupuesto. Y además esto ha llevado a una serie de revisiones en el sistema de universidades de Nicaragua. Ahora bien, yendo a lo que podríamos decir son propuestas, estos avances que mencioné son indicativos de un cierto avance en el estado de conciencia en este tema. Y este avance se expresa también, o se ha expresado también en 2 reuniones de alcance latinoamericano y caribeño muy importantes. La colega Alta Hooker acaba de hacer mención a una de ellas, voy a hacer mención a ambas. El primer paso está en la declaración de la Conferencia Regional de Educación Superior, la segunda, que se realizó en el año 2008 en Cartagena de Indias, en cuya declaración final, voy a leer textualmente, se incluyeron 2 recomendaciones explícitas sobre el tema. Y estos fueron acuerdos de rectores, ministros, especialistas en el tema que estaban presentes en la conferencia, en la cual esta declaración fue votada por cerca de 4.000 personas. Una de estas recomendaciones fue, leo, el reto no es solo incluir a los miembros de los pueblos indígenas y afrodescendientes en la educación superior, tal cual ella existe, sino transformarla para asegurar su pertinencia social y cultural. Se debe asegurar la incorporación de sus visiones de mundo, conocimientos, lenguas, epistemologías y formas de aprendizaje. Y la otra recomendación en la CRES del 2008 fue: es fundamental promover y facilitar el aprendizaje de las lenguas de los pueblos indígenas y afrodescendientes y su uso efectivo en docencia, investigación y extensión. Más interesante aún es que 10 años después, esta suerte de toma de conciencia y posicionamiento de las autoridades educativas de casi todos los países latinoamericanos y autoridades de las instituciones de educación superior en la CRES del 2018, realizada en Córdoba, Argentina, además de que se ratificaron esas 2 recomendaciones, se agregaron 5 más. Voy a mencionar rápidamente, sintéticamente, no textualmente en este caso, 3 de ellas. Las políticas e instituciones de educación superior deben contribuir proactivamente a desmantelar todos los mecanismos que generan racismo, sexismo, xenofobia y otras formas de intolerancia y discriminación. Otra, la formación de docentes interculturales bilingües debe ser un deber prioritario de la educación superior. Esto también está en instrumentos internacionales, pero la mayoría de los estados no lo cumplen. La tercera, es ineludible reconocer y valorar las epistemologías, modos de aprendizaje y diseños institucionales propios de pueblos indígenas y afrodescendientes, es decir, lo que solemos llamar simplemente universidades o instituciones de educación superior propias de estos pueblos. En 2018, para impulsar la materialización de estas recomendaciones, nuestra cátedra UNESCO lanzó lo que hemos llamado la Iniciativa para la Erradicación del Racismo. En el marco de esa iniciativa, ya hemos organizado 2 campañas de alcance latinoamericano para erradicar el racismo en la educación superior, en las que hasta el momento han participado equipos de 46 universidades de 6 países latinoamericanos. Y además hemos presentado, y ha sido respaldado por el Consejo Interuniversitario Nacional, un proyecto de ley para actualizar la Ley de Educación Superior de Argentina para que se adecúe a los derechos de pueblos indígenas y afrodescendientes que de hecho están en la Constitución Nacional, pero no en la Ley de Educación Superior. Bueno, estos son los senderos que tratamos de recorrer junto a muchas y muchos otros compañeros y compañeras en toda América Latina y, como se puede ver en esta pantalla, también más allá, afortunadamente. Muchas gracias.
Wonderful, Daniel. Thank you very much. And just also to note as well, I think you've already managed to touch on one of the questions that has been coming in. So thank you for picking that up in your response. Let's turn back now to Rajani. The floor is yours, Rajani. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'd just like to start by really paying homage to all of the students and the staff at the University of Bath who have come on this journey with me to look at race inequality in our own university. And we've looked at all sorts of levels, all disciplines, reporting and supporting, and ways in which to make our university more equal. And we will have a report out soon. And once it's public, I would be very happy to share it with all the members of our communities, our international communities that are here today. But what I would like to talk about today is really, for me, what was the most transformative experience of my whole life. And that was in the late 1980s. And it was to be involved in an institution called Kenya. And this was an institution that was set up in apartheid South Africa. The context for this is that at the height of apartheid, students were refusing to go to university. And they were basically saying, the country's burning. Why should we go into schools and university? We will take up the struggle and we will fight. So they were talking about liberation from apartheid before education. And Kenya set out a vision for a very alternative model of higher education. And we called for education for liberation. So we took on students that were political activists, that were working class, and that were Black. We did not use their school results to select them, because we knew the school results, if you go from a poor family into a school with no resources, you have no chance of doing amazingly well in any of the tests. So we developed our own tests to find out their academic potential, and we interviewed them to look at their motivation. The second thing we did is that rather than forcing the students to leave their political activism behind, to leave their cultures behind, the cultures that were so rich, in order to fit us as a university, we changed the university to fit the identity and the needs of the students. So we developed a curriculum where the students could see themselves. They could see their families, they could see their communities. They could understand their own history and their own literature. In South Africa at the time, all universities taught English literature. So we learned Shakespeare and Chaucer, but we knew nothing of the African writers on our continent. We knew nothing about our own history. But what we also did was, while we gave students the knowledge and the understanding of the local context, we also connected them to global knowledge canons. So we sought a balance between the global and the local and the national. We linked the students' work to community groups so that they would actually see how to implement the ideas that they were looking at, that they were researching within the university to the outside world in order to help oppose apartheid. And the students themselves became change agents. They would finish their first year with us and they would go into other universities and contribute to transformation. And we've done a little bit of tracking of those students, and all of them have gone into really important careers. So they've become critical journalists, they've become doctors, they've become nurses, and many of them have maintained that culture and that understanding of working in order to support everyone in South Africa rather than just working for themselves. And I always feel that if we could do something like this in a police state during apartheid, then it is something that many other universities that are in more powerful positions can replicate in a very positive way. The second issue that I would like to talk about is at the systems level. And I saw quite an interesting comment from a colleague in the chat about university leaders. And I'm slightly more hopeful here because I'm seeing more criticism now from university leaders of what I have termed the competition fetish in higher education. And this is where universities with very, very different missions in many parts of the world are forced into a competition with very negative consequences on racial equity. You know, so we're talking about rankings, we're talking about the battle for world-class status. And what this means is that governments put more and more funding into the most elite universities, which cater for the elite, while the universities that take on the biggest proportion of students from the most disadvantaged communities struggle with very, very low levels of support.
Yeah.
And I suppose what gives me a bit of hope is that university leaders, including those from the South, are now speaking out against this. So, for example, Professor Razak, who is a rector in Malaysia, has challenged all of us with the question, when we talk about world-class universities, whose world are we talking about? And Professor Razak's question has made me wonder whether we are talking about universities contributing to the world of finance capital, to the metropolitan and cosmopolitan elite, to the world of wage slaves who earn just enough to exist to work the next day, or to the indigenous communities who are in danger of losing everything, their culture, everything, their livelihoods, and something that the other panelists have been talking about in a very eloquent way in this panel.
Indeed. Rajani, thank you so much. I'm sorry to have to stop you. I really don't want to.
Fine.
But let's continue on afterwards. But I'm seeing, you know, even from our other speakers, you know, rounds of applause for everybody. There's so much powerful messages and sharing that's already taking place. So thank you again, Rajani. But let me now ask, if I may please, the second question. Let's turn now to our colleague Alta. Alta, tiene usted la palabra, por favor.
Sí, muchas gracias. En cuanto a algunas experiencias, voy a tratar de abordar más las que manejo, ¿verdad? Y que nos han venido trayendo muy buenos resultados en el caso de Nicaragua. Tal vez comenzar diciendo, lo planteaba Daniel, que en el caso de Nicaragua Nosotros contamos con 2 universidades comunitarias interculturales cuyo rector y rectora son afrodescendientes y que las universidades son como nuestro proyecto de vida, son las que se organizan para responder a nuestros sueños y aspiraciones, son los que hacen incidencia para ir diseñando y construyendo ese camino de la interculturalidad. Pero también está la red de universidades interculturales, indígenas, interculturales y comunitarias de Abya Yala, que está conformado de 10 universidades y hay otros que están por integrarse en estos momentos. ¿Y qué es lo que hacemos allí? Diseñamos currículum en conjunto, Daniel también ha sido parte de eso. Estamos por abrir el 3er doctorado en estudios interculturales. ¿Por qué? Porque necesitamos que los compañeros y compañeras indígenas y afrodescendientes, pero también mestizos, estén empoderados de sus ideas, de que estén empoderados, de que sí es posible hacer el cambio si nos juntamos de la mano y si caminamos juntos. Es un barco difícil de remar, pero lo hemos venido haciendo. En estos espacios, por ejemplo, aprendemos de que la alianza es importante, porque muchas veces también nos encerramos en las cosas que sentimos que es complicado y que el otro se va a reír y que no queremos compartir nuestras ideas. Pero las alianzas, las negociaciones, las incidencias son fundamentales para que podamos caminar. Pero también participamos en UNECA. UNECA es la organización negra centroamericana donde también hacemos investigaciones de manera conjunta y esas investigaciones nos ayudan a posicionar nuestros pensamientos, pero también a construir el discurso de qué es lo que queremos posicionar políticamente, porque tenemos espacio a los políticos, a los diputados en el Parlamento Centroamericano, entonces logramos hacer eso. Pero también me gustaría decir que en el caso de Nicaragua, Nicaragua tiene un marco legal robusto de derechos de los pueblos indígenas afrodescendientes. Tan así que nosotros en el Caribe nicaragüense respondemos a la ley de autonomía de los pueblos indígenas afrodescendientes y caribeños mestizos. Y que esto nos ayuda a que seamos nosotros los que dirigimos nuestros territorios. Estas 2 universidades comunitarias, su rector y su rectora, somos miembros del Consejo Nacional de Universidades, que es la instancia donde se toman las principales decisiones sobre la educación superior. Allí compartimos con nuestras propias voces lo que necesitamos en la educación en la costa Caribe. Pero también hemos logrado que en estos momentos Nicaragua, desde el Consejo Nacional de Universidades, tenga una comisión de interculturalidad. Esta comisión de interculturalidad entonces ya ha impulsado un diplomado de interculturalidad a todas las universidades del Consejo Nacional de Universidades. Esto nos ha ayudado mucho y en estos momentos se ha formado la Comisión Nacional de Interculturalidad, donde están las autoridades de ambas regiones autónomas, están las autoridades, los rectores y rectoras de las 2 universidades comunitarias, y son realmente espacios de diálogo, concertación y toma de acuerdo sobre la educación que soñamos y aspiramos. Pero también hemos avanzado, yo diría que, hemos avanzado porque participo como Consejo Nacional de Universidades, pero también participo como la Universidad del Caribe. Y aquí el Consejo Nacional de Universidades ha llegado al Caribe y ha tenido diálogo con los gobiernos regionales, con los gobiernos territoriales, y es lo que llamamos diálogo de saberes, porque cada uno hace sus planteamientos. Y ahí es donde, por ejemplo, nosotros hemos hecho el planteamiento de que líderes, lo que en algunos países llaman chamanes, nosotros llamamos mayores o llamamos guías espirituales, dan clases en nuestras aulas de clase o en las comunidades. Comparten la espiritualidad, nos mantienen pegados a las necesidades de las comunidades. Entonces, hemos venido avanzando en eso y como universidad como tal, contamos con las comisiones de lucha contra la discriminación y el racismo y que es avalado por el Consejo Universitario y que evalúa todo nuestro accionar. En fin, hay muchas acciones. Yo termino aquí diciendo que Daniel, cuando hace referencia a la CRES y los planteamientos de la CRES, ¿verdad? Estuvimos allí y fue realmente una lucha posicionando lo que creemos que deben ser, hacer las universidades. Y que son líneas claras, que si solo la aplicáramos, estaríamos avanzando años hacia lo que realmente sería la lucha contra el racismo y la discriminación. Muchísimas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Alta. Thank you so much. I'm going to give the floor to Verena, who will be answering the last question before we go on to our Q&A session. So, Verena, the floor is yours.
So thank you again. And for those who have just joined, the question is, could you comment on some experiences or proposals for transformations in academic practices and or in higher education institutions, systems and policies oriented towards the eradication of racism? Now, I'm speaking as a historian, and because the role of history is critical in our education system at all levels, and I want to address the proposals part of it. And I speak to the context of higher education in the Caribbean, the CARICOM region, because I know that we have had experiences from other contexts already. So in this regard, I say transformation requires the following. I don't know if I'll get through my list, but let's see how far I go. First of all, in our context, we say it requires embracing the philosophies of Marcus Mosiah Garvey, who said, a people without the knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. We need to water the trees and the roots. Transformation requires a belief in equity, adopting a social justice agenda in the teaching and learning processes and in the production of students and staff who can be scholar activists in the tradition, as I said, of Walter Rodney with his groundings strategy. Transformation requires a commitment to avoid partisan politics and sexism in funding and hiring within our universities. It requires the implementation of international conventions to which states parties are signatories. Many times the university community do not know about these agreements and these declarations, and therefore we must insist that they do, because our countries in many cases are signatories. And of course I have to mention the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which defines racial discrimination in Article 1. It is any distinction, exclusion, restriction, or preference based on race, color, descent, or national or ethnic origin, which has the purpose or effect of nullifying or impairing the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise on an equal footing of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, cultural, or any other field of public life. It requires the acceptance that the content of higher education institutions in post-colonial societies must follow the path of decolonial justice. This is because of the Eurocentric curriculum and texts used to teach that curriculum inherited from the colonial period. That colonial period was racist, and people extracted from their homeland and placed in a system of chattel enslavement, for example, were deemed as property by the laws drawn up by the enslavers. And many of the history texts and many sources, many of our scholars are still quoting from racist people like Thomas Carlyle and Anthony Trollope and Edward Long, you know? And I think we need to diverge from that, write our own story and indigenize the curriculum. And the legacy of slavery, colonialism, and patriarchy has made the Caribbean's attempts to spread a more liberating narrative of self very difficult, as discrimination has been a major cause of the lack of access to primary, secondary, and higher education in the Caribbean. And even a brief survey of the intention of colonial education in the British Empire will reveal that colonial education was structured since the 19th century to maintain class divisions and to narrow opportunities for such mobility. And that's why my colleagues at the University of the West Indies have been key to the process of change, as we have traditionally used our scholarship to critique narratives that need to be critiqued, created new knowledge, and address myths and stereotypes. And one of our first professors of history, Elsa Gavaya, warned from the 1950s that creation of these liberating narratives are important, because she said, in a region such as ours, where shame about the past too often fills the place that should be held by knowledge, knowledge of the past must play its part in our liberation from the bonds of the past. And at the University of the West Indies, the Vice Chancellor has rolled out for some time now, since 2017, what he calls the AAA strategy, ensuring access, alignment, and agility. And so, because since its establishment in 1948, the UWI has had to democratize and cement the democratization of education. So today, the AAA strategy rests upon three primary pillars: access, alignment, and agility; wealth creation and reduction of social inequality through greater and more affordable access; efficient and effective alignment with society and economy; and enhanced agility in pursuit of opportunities. And these are the strategic goals residing at the plan's core. And then funding. We have to find a way to make funding, affordable to those who are traditionally marginalized. We have to avoid making language a discriminatory factor to deny access and respect indigenous languages. And we have to finally go where people are if they cannot enroll formally in higher education sector. The UWI is among those universities that have gone outside the walls of academia to democratize learning. And many universities and academics have indeed shunned the path of the classic intellectual, sharing the view so well articulated by Edward Said. And I end with this quote: "The intellectual is an individual in society that confronts orthodoxy and dogma, who cannot be reduced simply to being a faceless professional, a competent member of a class, going about his or her business, but an individual endowed with a faculty for representing, embodying, articulating a message, a view, an attitude or philosophy or opinion to, as well as for, a public." And so this highlights the social responsibility element to education that all academics must embrace. Thank you very much.
Brilliant, simply brilliant. Thank you so much. So those were the sort of two questions that we'd asked the panelists to kind of consider in advance. And we can see from the chat how much this has kind of stimulated reflection and further questions from our full array of participants. We have nearly 200 people who are here live with us today. And as you know, the session is recorded, so I'm sure the reach will stretch even further. We'll do our best in the next 20 minutes or so to tackle some of the questions. But let me first turn to Daniel, because we've had a number of specific questions about the new proposed higher education law in Argentina. So briefly, Daniel, could I ask you to just to say a little more about that, because you started to talk about it in your recent response, but perhaps if you can just add a couple more details for us, and then Salma is going to ask, I think, a different question after that. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you to the person, to the people who raised the question. Yes, perdón, voy en español otra vez. Muchas gracias, Emma, y a la gente que hizo las preguntas. En efecto, nosotros impulsamos, junto con un grupo de abogados y abogadas especialistas en derechos de los pueblos indígenas, un proyecto de ley modificatoria de la Ley de Educación Superior de Argentina, porque esta ley, que es del año 95, no asegura los derechos de pueblos indígenas y afrodescendientes de acceso y exitosa trayectoria en la educación superior, ni de transformaciones curriculares, que están establecidos de base en la Constitución Nacional, reformada en el año 94. En cambio, esta ley sí asegura derechos específicos respecto de género, discapacidad, que en definitiva es la misma fuente de instrumentos internacionales. Este defecto de la ley debe ser corregido, la ley debe ser actualizada. Se hizo un proyecto que solo modifica 4 artículos de la ley, fue respaldado de manera unánime por el Consejo Interuniversitario Nacional, en el cual confluyen las casi 60 universidades públicas del país, nacionales y provinciales, y una diputada tomó este proyecto de ley y lo presentó al Congreso de la Nación, si mal no recuerdo, en diciembre o en enero, no estoy seguro. La diputada Alcira Figueroa, de la provincia de Salta. Y estamos esperando que el Congreso de la Nación trate esta modificación de la ley. Es algo sencillo, pero bueno, todavía no lo han tratado y esperamos que lo hagan. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Professor Daniel. I also have another question for you proposed from Julio Contreras. I'll ask you to briefly answer, and then I also want Dr. Verena to answer, because I know that she briefly touched upon this topic as well, by mentioning that we should not we should learn about our history and not through the lens of people who were always racist. So the question is, good morning, I have a question for Daniel. In the context of eradicating exclusion in the curriculum, what anti-racist guidelines can we implement for an intercultural learning assessment? Thank you very much.
It's for me, but also for Verena, is it?
Yes, correct.
Okay, I think that Verena, as well as Alta, Rajani, and myself have already advanced some ideas. The first thing I think, first of all, is to ensure the capability of using the languages in the higher education systems. It's not a matter of institutions only, it's a matter of decision making at system level. Otra vez inglés, perdón. Pero es también incluir los sistemas de conocimiento, incluir las epistemologías, y para esto es fundamental trabajar en colaboración con las comunidades y organizaciones de pueblos indígenas y afrodescendientes. Yo sé que Verena tiene mucho para decir en esto, o pienso, no podemos mantenernos aislados en nuestras así llamadas torres de marfil o de cristal. Las universidades creo que tienen un déficit precisamente, en general hay excepciones, por supuesto, hay iniciativas, pero como concepto se enfatiza mucho el trabajo en colaboración con el Estado, el trabajo en colaboración con las empresas, y se enfatiza menos el trabajo en colaboración directa con las comunidades y las organizaciones sociales. Creo que tenemos que dar un paso de este tipo, y esto está entre las recomendaciones de la CRES 2018, y sería bueno que sea incorporado en las recomendaciones de la Conferencia Mundial de Educación Superior que está por venir. Gracias.
Thank you. Professor Verena, can you continue, please?
Thank you. Well, I think that, as I think Daniel said, I think I covered quite a bit of this, but for emphasis, I would say that in terms of language, the University of the West Indies gives scholarships to students from indigenous communities access to the university. They have their nation language, but I must say that by the time students enroll and attend the University of the West Indies, all its 5 campuses, they are already proficient in the English language. Those who are not are assisted with the language lab, but more importantly, they learn the value of the nation language. We don't speak it enough in our society. There's discrimination in terms of people who speak the English language. It's a kind of English language imperialism that still exists. And we devalue the local language. But nevertheless, we encourage our students to be multilingual, to learn Spanish, for example, as well as French and English, because we don't want to deny them access to the international space. If they want us to go on to higher degrees in other universities, they should be free to. We're trying to encourage our students to go to Latin America, for example, to immerse themselves in the language. And our neighbors, for example, in Jamaica, our neighbors are Spanish and French-speaking people. So we need to get that language proficiency, but we have to interrupt this discrimination and hierarchizing languages and respect the languages that students come with, and also ensure that they are multilingual. I've spoken already about the value of going outside the walls of academia, because many of our universities are located nearby challenged communities. And we can't be just driving up in our cars and, or taking or whatever transport and going to the university, teach, go to class, go home, and we pass through some of these communities. So at the Mona campus of the University of the West Indies, there is a community called Augustown, named, because of the month of emancipation. And we have an outreach there. So it is important. And I think we have to also ensure that we're not so strict in our admission the qualifications for admission, that we exclude people who have experience. We have to be flexible, I think, in admission, so that we're not holding to, you must have 5, in our case, CAPE subjects or whatever it is. We have to look at people's application and try to develop an understanding of experience. And then I think we have to know what the colonizers said. If you don't know what was there and the ideologies of the past and what they wrote, you won't be able to criticize it and have this critical thinking and look at these race theories and so on in our classroom. So we have to also ensure that we empower our students to know the achievements of their ancestors and to emphasize to them that they have a right to education. And in many of our countries, we have charters of rights about the right to education, and certainly the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination in one of its articles speak to socioeconomic rights, including the right to education. So I think we have to also, the last point I want to make, it is critical. There's an African proverb about until the land, and I always say the lioness as well, writes his or her history. Then the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. So we have to indigenize the curriculum. We have to write our own story. I know that we have to use the archives of the colonialists, but I think we have to find a way to say our ancestors were not property. They were people. You put codes here. And we have to also, and we have been doing that at the University of the West Indies, talk about reparatory justice, because reparatory justice is also about, I have the right to go to school. I have the right. You denied my ancestors that right. We claim that right, and you must fund. You must put some finances into our education system because you extracted all resources, you developed your own country, and you left us in terms of weakened social infrastructures. So I think I'll just stop there.
Thank you so much. You have very good points. And I also think that we as listeners should have to ask ourselves, are we adding to this hierarchy by thinking that, because as a teacher, I've seen this myself, that some students that speak some of these languages that are looked highly upon are seen as a bigger resource than those who aren't, or has other languages in their system. So thank you so much. So on to the next question. How do we, and I think Professor Rajani can start by answering this. How do we tackle institutional defenses by leaders in higher education institutions who do not see a value in work to eliminate racial discrimination and whiteness within institutions and practices, especially in health and mental health care? So Professor Rajani, you may begin.
Thank you very much. It's a very difficult and challenging question. And the solution will be very, very different in different parts of the world, different types of universities, etc. And maybe here I can talk a little bit about, I go away from South Africa now and go into Britain and talk about my own experience at the University of Bath. One of the interesting issues is that it was very, very hard to get students and staff of color to trust us in the leadership to even talk about racism. So my first task, and I'll come back to how do we actually convince our leaders to take action, by first saying we have to go into the grassroots and we have to be really in contact with the students and the staff who are experiencing racism. And we have to firstly get them to trust us. Firstly, that we will do them no harm if they tell us honestly what they are experiencing. But more importantly, that we will do something about it. So I think it took me, when I took over as head of the Race Equality Task Force, it took me many, many months for students and staff to trust me. And the first thing they always said is, we are tired of reliving our pain. You know, everyone comes to us and we talk about our pain. We talk about the discrimination. People write the reports and they do absolutely nothing to change the situations and make things more equal. So I think to harness the people on the ground that are both suffering, but they're allies that are really working against racial discrimination is very, very important. And to take that as a powerful force to leaders of the institution and show them the evidence, and also show them the consequences of what happens if we don't change. And the consequences are not just about inequality, it's about having a culture in our universities that is so narrow that actually you can't do the important things that universities do if you can't innovate if you have all the people with the same culture. You can't innovate, you can't challenge, you can't learn about alternative worldviews. And I think a really good example is the medical schools in South Africa, where initially they were very, very Eurocentric. So South Africa has incredibly good medical schools, really highly regarded all over the world. But what we didn't have initially is what Cuba has, where the students in Cuban medical schools are taught to care about humanity, to care about the systems of racism and so on. So individual students cared a lot, but it wasn't really built into the system. And now that is happening. We're looking at preventative medicine. We're looking at tuberculosis rather than purely heart attacks that affect the richest people in our country. We're looking at the diseases that affect poorer people. But to connect to Alta's point, we're also looking at indigenous medicine. We're looking at our own shamans and how they aid healing, how they bring in community-centeredness. And we're looking at herbal medicine, all that important knowledge that has been lost. And I think we have to take all of this to our leaders and use indirect pressure, direct pressure, political mobilization, anything that we have to move them on this journey.
Thank you so much, Professor Rajani. So, Professor Alta, do you want to add on to this question?
Sí. He estado escuchando a Verene y a Rajani y realmente muchas de las cosas que plantean, nosotros pasamos por ello. Cuando digo eso, a nosotros nos consideraban como universidades de pobres. Los estudiantes no querían venir a nuestras universidades porque son sencillas, porque están mucho en las comunidades directamente, no son de esas 1000 libras de cemento, por ejemplo, donde no pueden pasar nuestros espíritus, donde realmente no sentí ese calor humano que es a la que estamos acostumbrados. Pero ya a estas alturas eso ha venido cambiando mucho y que lograr llegar allí no es fácil. Aquí decía Daniel, hablaba de la confianza. Ahora, yo siento que romper el tabú del racismo es la participación. Si nosotros no logramos que pueblos indígenas y negros, si nosotros no logramos que nuestros estudiantes de manera crítica puedan compartir en las aulas de clase, pero también salir de las aulas de clase y ir a su comunidad de vuelta, porque después se les olvida de dónde son, se nos hace sumamente complicado. Entonces, nosotros preparamos médicos. Al inicio era complicado porque son médicos generales interculturales, que quiere decir que aprenden todo lo que aprende un médico, pero también tienen profesores, guías espirituales, suquias, curanderos, parteras, también son sus profesores. ¿Por qué? Si pueblos indígenas y negros se enferman del crisis sickness, se enferman del humo, se enferman del hechizo, se enferman del isigne, ¿cómo le vas a poner un médico occidental? Ni nos conoce, ni entiende eso. Entonces, es nuestra responsabilidad preparar a esos médicos para eso. Pero para atender la salud mental es fundamental entonces tener psicólogas y psicólogos en contextos interculturales que también entiendan la enfermedad. La idea no es que ellos curan la enfermedad, ese no es su rol, sino que puedan tener esa relación con el médico tradicional, que puedan hablar y que puedan hacer las referencias y las contrarreferencias cada uno. Y eso lo incluye la red comunitaria del sistema de salud en Nicaragua. Entonces, eso nos lo hace mucho más fácil. Entonces, los estudiantes nuestros ya graduados como médicos interculturales ya están siendo preparados en las universidades nacionales con sus especialidades. Yo diría que tener un proyecto propio de vida no es fácil. Y muchas veces uno encuentra con barreras complicadas de poder sobrepasarla. Entonces, hay que saber cuándo avanzar rápidamente y cuándo tomar un paso para atrás. Y aprovechar las grandes declaraciones. La CRES 2018 tiene todo lo que los pueblos indígenas y afrodescendientes soñamos y aspiramos. Pero entonces tenemos que continuar incidiendo para que la educación superior en nuestros países asuman eso, ¿verdad? El poder lograr esas universidades propias, cuando digo propias, que son proyectos de vida construidos por nosotros, pero no podemos aislarlos porque no somos islas. Entonces tenemos que articularnos con el gobierno, tenemos que compartir nuestras aspiraciones y en Latinoamérica hay 16 países que ya han asumido y firmado el convenio 169, que también da salida a la declaración de la CRES. Hay muchas cosas buenas, muchas, pero el esfuerzo ahora parte desde cada uno de nuestros estudiantes, nuestros profesores y de nosotros, de no cansarnos, que nos importa si nos llaman universidades de pobres y continuar con nuestros sueños, agarrados de la mano con todos los diferentes aliados y los que nos quieren acompañar. Gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Alta. Such a rich discussion that we're having today, and unfortunately our time is about to close. I'm going to take the liberty of asking one final very quick and concrete question, because several of our colleagues, both in the chat and in the discussion on the screen, have raised the upcoming World Higher Education Conference, which is taking place in about 2 months under the auspices of UNESCO. And so perhaps the final question I could ask is, for one recommendation from each of our 4 panelists, what would you like to see taken forward regarding, let's call it, as the question writer put it, the problem of racism in higher education? What's a recommendation that can be taken up at this World Higher Education Conference, where UNESCO expects to bring several thousand delegates together? So one quick response, if I may, from each of you, and then our colleague Sarah will, unfortunately, with regret, have to close our session today. Over to you. Who would like to respond first?
Well, maybe I should just, I don't have all the information on that upcoming conference, but I just want to stress the importance of access, of democratizing access, because of the history that we have in our region. I also want to stress respect for students and the absence of hierarchizing by class or ethnic group when they come into a university in our spaces. And we must talk about the sexism also in promotion in our universities, because some people complain about that. So I would leave it there. And I hear Professor Hooker and the issue of how people look at our universities. I'm proud to say that our university is among the top 1.5% of universities. It's an excellent university. So the reputation will grow, and that will be solved, I'm sure, eventually.
Perfect.
Thank you very much.
Very many thanks indeed. Let's turn to Alta, and then Daniel and Rajani.
Sí. Bueno, comenzar diciendo, ¿verdad?, que agradezco enormemente este foro. Escuchar a las compañeras es muy empodera al espíritu y a la disposición de continuar el camino, que no nos podemos cansar y que hay que continuar tirando ese barco hacia adelante. Pero sí, yo continúo diciendo lo que la red de universidades indígenas, interculturales y comunitarias de Abya Yala hemos venido planteando. Nosotros aspiramos a que se retome lo del Congreso, lo de la CRES del 2008 y el 2018, que las universidades deben cambiar, que las universidades en lo general no es solo el acceso, no es cantidad de cupos, no es tal vez te permito y no te permito. La CRES fue clara en que la interculturalidad no es un apéndice, parte desde el mismo espíritu de construcción de las instituciones de educación superior. Y con eso nosotros estaríamos rompiendo contra el racismo. ¿Lo vamos a resolver hoy? No, porque es una cuestión de mucha data, pero sí estaríamos construyendo la ruta que aspiramos para poderle, para irlo abordando y buscándole una salida. Muchas gracias.
¿Voy yo? Sí, bueno, en realidad creo que Alta me quitó la recomendación de la boca. Pienso que sería muy importante que la Conferencia Mundial de Educación Superior tome explícitamente las recomendaciones de las dos conferencias regionales de educación superior respecto de este tema, la del 2008 y 2018. Hay que interculturalizar la educación superior. Además, hay que hacerla antirracista, lo cual quiere decir revisar el papel que las universidades y la educación superior en general han jugado en pro del racismo. Enseñar las historias de nuestras sociedades y del mundo, porque están combinadas el racismo no es si bien hoy lo vivimos dentro de nuestras sociedades, hacia la construcción del mundo moderno y las metrópolis, así llamadas, de los tiempos coloniales, siguen jugando lugares imperiales en todo esto, entonces esto tiene que ser revisado. Es muy importante que un encuentro internacional como la Conferencia Mundial respalde estas recomendaciones, porque ya vemos que en general los instrumentos y declaraciones internacionales sirven para avanzar en esta lucha en los respectivos países, en las respectivas universidades. Antes que no tenga más tiempo para hablar, quiero agradecer muchísimo la invitación y muchísimo la compañía de las colegas y de las moderadoras y en general del equipo del IESALC y de la gente que nos acompaña del otro lado de las pantallas. Muchísimas gracias.
Alta, Daniel, thank you so much. Rajani, let me turn to you before we call today's session to an end.
Okay, so thank you very much. I would like to say that we have to take our anti-racist struggles that we are engaging with in society as well as in universities into the climate change and climate emergency agenda. I think this is absolutely crucial because all the worst effects of the climate emergency, the people that really suffer are disadvantaged communities, indigenous communities who suffer from the terrible catastrophe that is being wreaked upon us in relation to climate change. And we know that poorer southern countries have the worst consequences, while the rich countries actually keep maintaining the same agenda. And my fear is that while we're fighting for climate justice, we forget or we put in parallel the struggle for racial justice. And actually what I think is the two struggles need to connect, and we have to go forward in that way. And just want to join Daniel to say thank you very, very much to everyone for this amazing seminar.
I couldn't agree more. Colleagues, thank you so much. There's been so much that we've managed to discuss today, so much that we still need to discuss. Perhaps the analogy to use is that together we've lit a fire, and I think the responsibility is on all of us to keep the fire going, to keep it healthy, to keep it burning, and to make it look as it should. So what I've heard in these sort of final points, thinking ahead to the World Higher Education Conference, at which our institute is going to be able to take further some of our own work on the right to higher education, which I'm thrilled to say touches on at least some of these points, but it's given us inspiration that we must take forward as well in our work. We've talked about democratizing access and respect for students, about removing or overcoming the hierarchies that still exist when it comes to class, obviously race, sex, and so on. We've talked about taking interculturality seriously and the need to interculturalize our higher education. And our final point, I think, to take forward was about remembering the intersectionalities, and specifically the mention between the anti-racist struggle and the climate emergency. But I think I heard many other intersections being raised and brought forward today. So from my side, I can't thank you enough, panelists, and to our participants today. Without wishing to go on any further, let me hand over to Sarah now. So thank you again, everybody, seriously and deeply.
Gracias. En nombre de UNESCO IESALC, entonces hacemos extensivo nuestro sincero agradecimiento a nuestros ponentes hoy, Daniel Mato, Rajani Naidoo, Alta Hooker y Verena Shepherd, a nuestras intérpretes Elena Paván Macías y María Perino, a Sabzalieva y a Salma Ahmed por facilitar las preguntas y respuestas, y al equipo del IESALC que trabaja arduamente tras bastidores para que todo suceda, Neus Pasamonte, Yara Bastidas, Claudia Delgado y Eduardo Betancourt. De parte de todos, extendemos nuestro agradecimiento a todos ustedes por habernos acompañado en este evento y por su compromiso compartido para superar el racismo en la educación superior. Por favor, manténganse en contacto con nosotros a través de nuestra página web bilingüe en inglés y español y en las redes sociales. Nuestro sitio web es www.iesal.org. iesalc.unesco.org, y pueden encontrarnos en Twitter, Facebook, Instagram y LinkedIn buscando UNESCO IESALC. Gracias de nuevo por acompañarnos, esperamos verlos en nuestros próximos eventos, y antes de despedirnos les pedimos a nuestros invitados mirar a la cámara para una foto final. Muchas gracias y hasta pronto. Gracias.